Hi, welcome back to Joe Blogs. In today's episode, I want to talk to you about what's happening in the economy in Russia, and specifically to talk about the economics of the war in Ukraine. Now, historically, when we looked at the cost of a war, it was quite simple. You basically worked out how much you used in terms of materials, how many bombs, guns, ammunition, planes, tanks you lost during that campaign, and you could add that to the cost of the people that you sent over to that war. So basically, you could work out the daily amount that you were paying all of your soldiers, how many days that war ran for, how many people you lost, and what the compensation payments that you need to make to the families of all of those people was, and therefore you could have an absolute total to say this was the amount that that war cost us. However, today things are far more complicated, and in today's video we'll go through the details of the actual costs to Russia, because it's not just the cost of the equipment and the people. Obviously, we've got an enormous amount of sanctions that have been applied against Russia. They're also losing valuable points of infrastructure all across Russia because Ukraine is now attacking them on a daily basis with all of their drones. And in addition to all of that, because Ukraine has now invaded the Kursk region, Russia is having to count the cost of that damage. So there are multiple different factors that we'll go through in today's video. Now, historically, when you're talking about a war, you would always bet on the richer nation. If you've got more money and more resources, then generally speaking, you should win the war because you can overpower the opposition. However, over the last 50 to 100 years, things have changed. And I think the Vietnam War was a really good example of a situation where one nation, the USA, had a lot more financial ability and a lot more military firepower than the Vietnamese. And so on paper, you would have expected the USA to win that war relatively quickly. However, that war lasted for a very long period of time. And the reason why it did was firstly because the Vietnamese used guerrilla tactics. So they didn't look to have a face-to-face war with the USA. They wanted to disrupt the USA's forces, to hit them where they weren't expecting it, and to do things that were very difficult to defend against. And also that created a massive amount of uncertainty for the USA when they are progressing through very hostile terrain. But in addition to that, Vietnam was also supported by China and the USSR. They provided a huge amount of financial and military support to keep that war effort going. And what we've got in Ukraine is quite a similar situation. From a financial perspective, from a number of people perspective, and from a military equipment perspective, Russia is infinitely more powerful than Ukraine. And so on paper, you would have expected Russia to easily win that battle. And that's exactly, I think, what President Putin expected when he called this a 3-day war. He expected it to be over very quickly in exactly the same way as what happened in 2014 when Russia invaded Crimea, which was previously part of Ukraine, and Ukraine wasn't given a huge amount of support by the rest of the world, and Russia annexed that area and has been occupying it ever since. However, what's happened in Ukraine this time around is very different, because Ukraine has been given a huge amount of financial and military support. So it's being backed by the West, the USA, Europe, Canada, Australia, and multiple other countries are providing both weaponry and money to keep the Ukraine fight going, and that's causing problems from Russia's point of view. But in addition to that, in the same way as Vietnam employed guerrilla tactics against the USA in the Vietnam War, Russia is now experiencing the same sort of thing with regards to drone warfare. And drone warfare is a new modern development that didn't exist for the Vietnam War. But basically what it means is that you can create drones at a very low cost, as low as $500 in some situations, that can have explosives attached to them. And those explosives, if they hit an oil refinery or a gas facility, they can cause a huge amount of damage. And that's exactly what's happening right now. Ukraine is deploying its own form of guerrilla tactics against Russia, and that's causing Russia infinite problems. This footage that was posted in Russia on X shows an oil refinery in the Kamensky district of Rostov that was hit by a drone attack on the 28th of August. And the Russian authorities have announced that 3 oil tanks have been set ablaze and that fire is still raging. And these sort of fires are notoriously difficult to put out, and it was reported by Reuters recently that an attack that took place on a similar refinery in Russia on the 20th of August is still burning now 8 days later. And the reason why these drone attacks are so devastating from Russia's point of view is that they're very difficult to defend against, because Ukraine is sending hundreds of drones every single day to lots of different areas of Russia. So they're not targeting one specific site that would be relatively easy to defend against. They are targeting all of Russia's oil and gas facilities. And in addition to that, they are now starting to attack military facilities within Russia. They're trying to bomb missile bases and things like that to prevent Russia from being able to send more missiles over to Ukraine. So this is becoming a major problem from Russia's point of view. And just to put the sheer volume of drones that Ukraine is using into perspective, this graphic shows a selection of some of the long-range drones that they're using to attack Russian facilities. And as you can see here, these come in a variety of different shapes and sizes, and they are not just single-use missiles. I think the common perception of an attack drone is that it's a warhead that's strapped to some sort of flying device, and you fly that device using your remote control camera into the target that you want to hit. But drones like the Sky Ranger Ninja and A-22 Foxbat are more like planes. You can fly them unmanned, and they can have multiple explosive devices attached to them, which can be released in exactly the same way as you would do with a bomber plane from World War II. Now, a lot of the drones in that graphic are actually produced by other countries. So Ukraine, at the start of the war, was buying them in, and it's received a lot of financial support. The European Union has committed to providing 1 million drones to Ukraine. And recently, there was a coalition of 5 countries set up: the United Kingdom, the Netherlands, Sweden, New Zealand, and Latvia, who've committed to provide $49 million in financial support to enable Ukraine to have more drones. So Ukraine is getting a lot of financial support, but in addition to that, it's now developed its own drone industry. And Ukraine says that in 2024, it will produce 1 million drones. And that would be the equivalent of around 2,700 per day. Now, obviously, not all of those drones are attack drones. Some of them are going to be used for surveillance. However, much of the development effort is going into attack drones. So if we assume that 50% of those drones are used for attack purposes, that would be 1,350 drones per day that Ukraine would be able to launch at Russia. And interestingly, Ukraine have now said that they've got the capability of producing 3 million drones per year. Now, if they got to that level, that would be over 8,500 drones per day that they would be producing. And if half of those were attack drones, that would be more than 4,000 drones per day that Ukraine could launch against Russian infrastructure. And that really puts into perspective the problem that Russia has in terms of defending all of those drones. Ukraine has developed a new drone, a long-range missile drone that it's been working on for around 18 months, called PALIANYTSIA. So let's have a look at the video that was released recently by United24, which is the official agency from Ukraine talking about this drone.
Every Ukrainian knows the word PALIANYTSIA. It refers to a type of bread. It is used to distinguish Russians. Due to differences in language, they cannot pronounce it correctly. But now they will have to learn this word from a completely different perspective. The state has launched a grant program for private rocket projects, invested in state design bureaus, and implemented deregulation to stimulate this industry. And here are the first results. Introducing PALIANYTSIA, the first Ukrainian long-range rocket drone. Most of its technical characteristics are classified to avoid revealing capabilities to the enemy. However, we have learned a few details. 24 Russian military airfields are within its strike range. The structural features are classified. Well, almost. The PALIANYTSIA will be launched from a ground platform. It uses a turbojet engine. It is equipped with electronic countermeasures. The rocket drone is connected to a satellite and therefore knows its exact location. If the connection is lost, there are other systems to keep it on the required trajectory. And what about the price and number of rocket drones? Modern systems cost millions of dollars per launch. Here, the cost is much lower than its counterparts. Moreover, the work on cutting the cost and increasing production is ongoing. Why is this so important? In the 2.5 years of full-scale war, Russia has launched over 43,000 various types of missiles and glide bombs at Ukraine. It still dominates the air. Yet the Americans and the Brits still do not allow the use of their ATACMS and Storm Shadow missiles against Russian airfields, where carriers of missiles and heavy aerial bombs are based. So Ukraine is looking for its own response. Real Russian air bases catch fire from Ukrainian drone raids more and more often. Just on the night of August 14th, military airfields Halina, Savasleika, Borisogrebsk, and Baltimore were hit. On August 21st, a radio reconnaissance center and an airport near Moscow, as well as the Millerovo air base. News of drone attacks on Russia is now almost daily, but rocket drones are better. They fly faster and carry a larger warhead.
Now, as you've just seen, the full details have not been released by Ukraine, so we don't know how many of these PALIANYTSIA drones that they have. But they will cause major problems for Russia because they can travel very long distances and carry a large amount of explosives. So if they hit their intended targets, they will cause the maximum amount of damage. And that really takes me on to what I talked about at the beginning of today's video, the economic impact of this war from Russia's perspective. Now, clearly, the cost of the war is mounting on a daily basis. Russia is using a lot of equipment and it's losing people who are either dying or being injured, and they're having to pay for hundreds of thousands of soldiers to be in Ukraine on a daily basis. So all of that is mounting up, and I've talked about this in many other videos. The cost in 2024 of the war in Ukraine is estimated to be 50% higher than it was in 2023. And if Russia continues its current campaign at the current level, then it's likely that those costs will rise even further. But it isn't just about the actual cost of equipment and people. The economic impact on Russia's economy is absolutely enormous because we have never seen sanctions being applied against a nation at the same level as Russia is facing right now. Countries such as Venezuela and Cuba have faced sanctions for a long period of time. But generally speaking, those sorts of sanctions are from a limited number of countries, and so the economic damage hasn't been anywhere near as bad as it is for Russia. What we have from Russia's point of view is the majority of the West have joined these sanctions. We have got some of the largest economies in the world who are now refusing to do business with Russia. And most of those economies were Russia's biggest customers before the war started, because Russia was selling the majority of its oil and gas directly to Europe because all of those countries were located very close. And as I've talked about before, Russia had built pipelines to supply gas and oil to lots of different countries. Now, the vast majority of those pipelines are no longer being used, and so Russia has had to find new buyers. And those new buyers have come predominantly in the form of China and India. However, the sanctions are now being imposed against any company from China and India that's found to be dealing with a company in Russia that has been sanctioned. So this is referred to as secondary sanctions. And that's now putting even further pressure on Russia because they're struggling to be able to receive things like payments from China and India. They're also struggling to be able to get payments in the currency that they want because nobody wants to use the ruble. And Russia is also struggling to find enough imports because historically it was buying lots of things from Europe and it can't do that anymore. So it's now having to go through the grey market or to buy things from India and China. So overall, the economic impact of the sanctions has been absolutely enormous. And those sanctions are increasing on a weekly basis. We're constantly hearing about more and more companies that are being added to the sanctions list. So the walls are closing in on Russia from a sanctions point of view. In addition to the sanctions, there's also the people cost of all of the people that fled Russia as a direct result of the start of the war. A lot of people, particularly higher educated and more senior people in companies, decided that they didn't want to hang around and run the risk either of themselves or family members being recruited to go and fight in Ukraine. So it's been reported that Russia has lost around 1.2 million people on a permanent basis. And a lot of those people were senior management. So the most important people you have in companies, because they're making all the decisions and driving businesses forward. And people are a really valuable commodity, particularly in Russia, which has had a high death rate and a low birth rate for the last 20 years, so it's got a declining population. So the loss of those people is going to have a really long-term impact on the Russian economy. Lots of different companies like ExxonMobil, BP, Shell, Ford, PepsiCo went to Russia to try to develop their market and also to help them build their industries. But as a result of the invasion, most of those companies walked away from Russia and they've left Russia to their own devices. Now that's a problem from Russia's point of view because firstly, they don't have the technical expertise to be able to keep those facilities operating. Secondly, they've also lost the supply chains. So where they were buying things in from other countries, components that are important when you're building things, they can no longer get those components. And thirdly, they've lost access to technology. And technology is absolutely critical, particularly when you're talking about cutting-edge oil and gas facilities that operate in really cold climates. So all of that is really bad news for the long-term prospects from Russia's point of view. The long-range drone attacks that Ukraine are now launching onto infrastructure in Russia is having a massive impact because those facilities are being taken out of action. Refineries are having to be closed when they're hit because there's a whole sequence in a refinery. So even if only one small part of your facility is struck, it can close down the whole facility for days or weeks or months. And so Russia loses all of the income that it was previously generating from that facility. And because this infrastructure is closing down all across Russia, it's now having a devastating impact both financially, but also people in Russia are now realizing that the war in Ukraine is a genuine war. It's not just a special military operation. Ukraine surprisingly decided to cross the border into Russia and is currently occupying around 500 square miles of Russian territory. Now, Russia wasn't expecting this to happen, and so it didn't have any military power in there to be able to stop Ukraine, and it's now struggling to be able to push them back because all of their military is sitting in all of the occupied areas of Ukraine. So this has been a really surprising counter-offensive, a counter-punch from Ukraine's point of view, and that's causing problems from Russia's point of view, particularly because word is spreading that Ukraine is now invading and taking over Russia. And I think from President Putin's point of view, this is entirely embarrassing because he's always said if anybody attacked Russian territory, he would be prepared to use nuclear force. Now, clearly, he hasn't done that, and he hasn't talked about bombing anywhere close to Ukraine. If he does, I think it will be obviously shooting himself in the foot because he's trying to take over part of Ukraine on a permanent basis. So I think the last thing that he would want to do is set off a nuclear explosion somewhere in Ukraine. And also, obviously, there's the risk that the West then gets involved and we could have some sort of disaster scenario that I don't want to go into in this video. So what's the summary and conclusion today? Well, I wanted to post this video because I think the economic implications of the war in Ukraine are absolutely fascinating. As I said right at the start of today's video, historically, when you looked at the cost of a war, it was basically the equipment and the people costs. Simple as that. That was what it was going to cost you to get involved in some sort of fight. However, today it is far more complicated than that, particularly from Russia's point of view, because in addition to the cost of the equipment, which is rising and is huge, Russian military are spending an absolute fortune on missiles on a daily basis. In addition to that, they've also got all their people costs, and they are huge and rising as well. Russia is struggling to be able to find enough soldiers. It's losing a lot of men. Potentially over 100,000 people have either been killed or wounded so far. The USA has estimated that it could be as high as 300,000, that figure. I don't know the exact numbers. It's a guesstimate, but whatever it is, it's huge. And there is a long-term damage to the economy that causes, because when the war in Ukraine ends, those people would have returned to normal everyday life. They would have had a job, they would have paid income tax, and so they would have contributed to the Russian economy. But obviously, now that they're dead or unable to work, they won't be able to do that. But in addition to the genuine costs of the war, the actual costs of the fight itself, Russia is also facing a lot of other economic disasters. The sanctions against Russia are the most comprehensive that have ever been applied against any country in the world. This is a devastation from Russia's point of view because they have lost the vast majority of their historic customer base. They were selling huge amounts of commodities to Europe historically. They are no longer doing that. They're having to sell them to two countries, India and China. And both of those nations are now coming under increasing pressure of secondary sanctions. So the sanctions are destroying the Russian economy. I've talked about this in lots of previous videos. But in addition to that, Russia is now also facing problems with regards to the drone attacks. And the drones are very difficult to defend against because, firstly, they're very small. Secondly, they're unmanned, so they don't generate a lot of heat. Thirdly, they are attacking multiple different locations on a daily basis all across Russia, which makes it really difficult to defend against. And lastly, when those drones hit one of your facilities, it can close that refinery or base down for weeks and months. So the economic impact of that is absolutely disastrous. But I think the final issue that we talked about today is possibly the most interesting. Over the past few weeks, Ukraine has launched a counter-offensive into Russia, and it's occupying around 500 square miles of Russian territory. Now, that hasn't happened since World War II, since the Nazis tried to invade Russia. And this, from Russia's point of view, is really not something that they're wanting to happen. Now, President Putin hasn't made any official statements about this yet in terms of what he's going to do. He hasn't come out and said that he's going to push Ukraine back. He has said that Ukraine have invaded the territory, and he's claiming that they are the offender here. However, obviously, Ukraine are doing it as part of their strategy against Russia. Now, what happens in terms of that region will be quite interesting because at the moment, obviously, all the economics that region was producing have been lost from Russia's point of view. It won't be producing all of the things that it was historically. And so this is just something else to add to the economic impacts that Russia is facing. But I think what it has done is raise the awareness within Russia that Russia is in a genuine war right now. And when you're looking at a potential threat of either drone attacks or actual invasion of your land, I think that changes the perspective. When it's a faraway war that doesn't really impact anybody, I think everybody can go around their normal day lives not even thinking about it. But when there is potential that you might know somebody who's involved because their home has been taken over as part of the offensive by Ukraine, that changes things permanently. And I think that's what's happening in Russia right now. It will be really interesting to see whether there is any acceleration of peace talks, whether Russia try to come around the table and agree some sort of ceasefire with Ukraine and get that land back. I think that potentially is one of Ukraine's strategies. President Zelensky is speaking to Joe Biden shortly to talk about what the strategy is, including the invasion of Kursk. And I think this is all part of a bigger plan to get some sort of resolution on the war itself. But in terms of the question that I asked right at the start of today's video, is it possible for Russia to win this war? Well, on paper, Russia should be the favourites. They've got significantly more people, they've got a bigger economy, they've got more military power, and they've got more soldiers. However, wars these days are not being fought on a traditional basis. This isn't like it was back in the 1500s, where two armies came face to face on the battlefield, and whoever won was declared the winner there and then. Wars go on for a very long period of time. And what we've seen and what we've talked about in today's video is that the tactics that are being employed by Ukraine, their defensive tactics, are using drones. And what's great about drones from Ukraine's point of view is firstly, they are low cost, so they can produce lots of them, thousands of them per day. Secondly, they're unmanned, so you don't lose people. If those drones get shot down or they're unsuccessful, then it doesn't cost a life. It just costs $500 or whatever the cost of that drone was. But thirdly, they are very difficult to defend against because they are small, they're fast moving, and multiple are being launched on a daily basis onto different locations. So Russia literally doesn't know which way to look. It doesn't know where these things are coming from. And if these drones strike the facilities that they're targeting, they can have huge economic damage. And as we saw earlier in the video, the PALIANYTSIA drone that's been created by Ukraine is big, it will cause maximum damage, and it is a very difficult missile to defend against. And if Ukraine is able to produce multiple PALIANYTSIA drones and start launching them all over Russia, we could see the face of this war changing very quickly. We may see Russia deciding that it no longer wants to proceed with the war and decides that it wants to come to some sort of peace agreement. Now, obviously, I don't know whether that's going to happen, but I'm just talking through all the different potential outcomes. So the overall summary of today's video is that the cost of the Ukraine war from Russia's point of view is absolutely enormous. Not just the cost of the equipment and the people, but also the sanctions, the infrastructure that it's losing, and it's now actually lost some of its own territory. So hopefully you've enjoyed today's video, you found it useful, informative and thought-provoking. If you've liked what I've said, then please give me a thumbs up. Thank you for watching this video all the way through to the end, and here's something to put a smile on your face.